recording now. Let me try to do a very, very quick rewind / fast forward. So in case you're watching the video, you should be able to like at least pause the video at important parts. Okay, so I downloaded this repo from student roster example right here. This is just, you could use anything. You don't have to use this at all. You can create your own app, but I just happen to start from here, so I didn't have to start from scratch. Then what I did is I created a virtual environment, I installed Django, and then I took a look around. The important parts, the views, I decided that I wanted to modify the view, and I want to add another field to my model, and then I want to make an API request to get additional data so I can insert that into the row. The model started out without this question. I ran the migrations, and then I reran the migrations, making sure that null was true, because you can't add, if you have a table and you have data in it already, and you add a non-nullable field, then your migration isn't going to work because you're creating a contradiction in the database. So if you add a new column, typically you're going to want to make it a nullable column. So did that, reran the migrations. And then we had this problem where, okay, I want to use this API key, and this API key comes from this, this is more or less random, more or less chosen at random API. Quiz API, I created an account and they gave me an API key, which is this. This is my secret credential. I didn't pay for it, so it's okay. But if I did pay for it, I would not show it to anyone. And then I looked at the documentation. So the documentation for different APIs is going to be, very wildly often in quality. So this one is fairly simple. The examples that they give you are in curl, but I don't want to use curl. But regardless, this curl request is going to get translated to a GET request with query params. And here's an example of the return value. It turns out when I actually wrote this in Python, it didn't like the query parameters for whatever reason. Maybe I just didn't play around with it for long enough, but I found out that it also accepts a header called X API key. X is often, I think X is a standard prefix for custom, as in non-official standard headers. So this API expects a certain header with this API key, and if I give it that, then I can get some kind of result. So the problem is that I don't want this being exposed. I don't want to check it into my source code and make it available on GitHub. So I need to restrict access or hide this credential. There are a few ways to do that. One of them is to create a .env file in your repo, which you will then add to your gitignore so that you do not check it in. Where's my gitignore? Yeah, there it is. So I added .env here, so this does not get checked in the source code. And the format here is key value pair. So just like environment variables, if you look in your bash profile, it'll have this same format. So one minor gotcha is that there are no quotes here, so you don't need to quote strings. Okay, so I have my environment variable. Now I need to inject it into my Django application, right? So I have it locally in this other file. I've pulled it out of my application. Now I need to actually use it. So I'm going to go into the settings file. That's where you do that in Django. And then I'm going to ultimately end up adding it here. So this will be API key equals something. I'll just do none for now. And then once I have that in my views, I can actually import that. So we'll look at that in a second. Where we are now is, how do I actually grab that value that's in the .env file and put it here? One way of doing that is to use this particular third-party module called Django Environ, which I pip installed. So I did pip install Django Environ, and then I also ran pip freeze requirements.txt because my application was getting complicated and there were lots of third-party modules. So just to keep tabs on things, I created a requirements.txt file. Once I had this third-party library, I went and looked at the documentation, and so now we're trying to figure out how to actually use this. So sorry about the repeat there, but okay. So first thing, let's import Environ. We'll just import both of these. Might need both. I'm going to go to my settings file, and I'm going to import these two new things. And I'll copy this. I'm just going to get rid of this. I don't think you don't need anything. You can play around with different things and read the documentation, but we don't need to worry about that right now. And then it's obviously got to do some kind of setup. I don't understand how it works. I just hope that it does work. It looks like it's going to try and read from the .env file, which is right here. So if this were at a different level, we would have to. So the example assumes that your .env file is at the same level as the root of your project. If it's somewhere else, you'll have to modify that. And then finally, we can do something like this. Now, this debug we don't want. What we want is API key. Yeah. We'll get rid of that. So you definitely don't need a third-party module for this. You could definitely do it yourself. It's basically just, reading an environment variable, but something from a file. But here we go. So we have, so now we're being, we're being more secure, we're being more professional. So we have this credential not checked in the source code. All right, so we've gone from the credential is in this .env file. Now the credential is in the settings file, but we need it where we actually call this function. So we can import, you can import the settings. So from Django.conf.settings, I believe this is it. Maybe I'll just import the whole thing. Import. Let's do this. Okay, so from Django.conf import settings, and that's how you get access to whatever you put in here. So this API key should be available to us. So I'll just go ahead and API key equals settings dot API key. So we should have pulled that all the way through. So I'm going to run the server, and I'm just going to print this and make sure that it worked. Actually, maybe I'll do. Let's see if I can. Django. I. Delta. Okay, so I need to give it a. Let me see here. So I'm creating. I want to create this debug file, but because I opened this basically not at the root of my project, I'm going to have to add one more. So workspace folder is going to be basically where VS Code was opened. So this is injected. This is a templated value or interpolated value. and then I'll add is it Django tests? Django tests. One other, I forget where this was. Let's do student roster example just to make sure. Okay, so here's this is a debugging configuration. So when it runs, it should execute run server and manage.py. So if I want to add a breakpoint and test my code, this by default, you can modify this, but by default, it's going to run your server. So you can like click around and stuff and it should stop at your breakpoint. So let's see if this works. Let me go back to my views. So I've got a breakpoint there. All right, so I'll go ahead and run this. Looks like that's working. Okay, so let's go here to /all. That should be good. And then I'm going to go to new. And I still haven't hit it because I need to make a post request. So if I make a post request, hopefully this will work. Okay, so I made a post request and then this breakpoint hit. So now I can stop here and take a look around at different variables. So let's see. Request. Let me see. Debug console. Let's see. Where do I go here? Forget where this actually. Does anyone have an, I forget where you can actually interact with the terminal here. Well, in any event, I'm just going to add this API key variable here to the watch list. And then I'm going to step down. So now I can see that this actually exists. So all that to kind of show that you can walk through the application. You can use print statements, but you can also kind of stop things and play around if you want to. For some reason, I can't. I forget. I thought it was here. Has anyone used this before? We can run like it's basically like a Python shell. You can look at all your variables. Yeah. All right. I'll play around with that later, but. Okay. Anyway, so that's how you can add a breakpoint there and do that. So I'm going to stop this, remove this breakpoint, so I can see that API key is actually working. So I know that's working. So I'm going to just copy this. And I know I'm going to have to make this request. So I need to use the requests library, but I don't have it installed. So I'm going to do pip install requests. Let's go back to the views. And I'm going to also update my requirements.txt. So pip freeze. It's like I created another one side of here. This CD. Okay, so I'll do that from here. Okay, so now the correct requirements.txt gets updated, and there's several other things here, even though I just added request, but request depends on some other things that got added. Okay, so now my requirements are updated, so I'm going to import this. So to import all right. So now that I've done that, I can just stop here. So I'm going to add another breakpoint right here. And I'm going to run the debug again. Okay, and then I will go add a new one. And here we freeze up. And I want to look at let's go down one. So I can hover over this, and I can see that I get an actual result. So I know that my request is successful because this is full of random garbage. Okay, so what we want to do now is parse this JSON and take out what we need. So we could also format this, and we're getting a whole bunch of questions. We could look at the documentation and figure out how to just get one, but for now, I'm just gonna grab the first one. So question equals res 0, and then the key is question. All right, and then here, when I create an object, I'm just going to add this other field. So question equals question. And question, I'll stop this. Question is expected in our model now. So we added that. Okay, so I'm just going to run the server and we'll check and we'll see if we can actually add someone. Oh, one other thing we should do is in the templates. So let's make sure that in the detail view, we can actually get that value. So right now, the template is not going to render that, but we'll add that. Question student dot question. So now this will actually show up in the HTML template. All right, so I'm going to run the server. This is what happens when you don't open the project at root level. All right, so new. So it took another second. And this time we have an actual question here. Now for the first one, I believe we didn't have a question, so we get none. So the ORM will turn SQL null into Python none. Okay, so that functionality is working. So now what we're going to need to do is actually start writing these tests. So Sorry, that took a little longer than I anticipated, but I think we've got that extra stuff going now. So why don't we take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back and we'll write some tests. Okay, so first thing I like to do real quick is I was fumbling around earlier and the debug terminal and couldn't find it. It's actually right here. So I'm just going to run in debug mode again. Oops. So this is running in debug mode, and I can go create a new student, and then it's going to stop here. And I can actually go right here. If I click on this, the debug console, and here's where I can actually see all of the values that are available to me at this point in the program. So if I want to see what res is, of course, you can hover over it and look at it in here, whatever. We can also do res. So for example, res is a complex thing, right? So if you wanted to just check what it was, you could do res at 0. And then, okay, what about res at 0? And then I think what we're actually going to get is question. Then you get this. Then you could also, you can also manipulate this like upper. So you can do normal Python stuff, but it's a nice way sometimes to play around without having to like, okay, if I run this, I'll print this, and then I'll run it again and I'll print this, and then I'll run it again and I'll try this, and so you can save yourself some cycles by doing something like that. All right. All right, so back here, we're going to start writing our test. So our application is now like where we want it. We can make this request somewhere else. We can add it to our model. All right, so to write tests, it's very similar to what we've seen with normal Python unit test. From Django.test, import test case. So I'm going to jump into the source code real quick. And you can see that, well, it tells you some things about it. But I'm going to, so test case subclasses, transaction test case. So I'll take a look into that, which goes to simple test case, which, surprise, surprise, ends up subclassing from unit test.test case. So, there's a decently complex hierarchy there, which you don't really have to worry about, but you can use it, and it gives you a bunch of stuff. In addition to everything you get from unit test, you get some other stuff. So we'll create class, and this will be like models test, for example, and test case. So our Django application has lots of components, right? We have models, we have these templates, we have URLs, we have views, and we can test these components individually. So I'm going to test models first, and then I'll do some views tests. Okay, so let me look at the Django documentation. So testing in Django, there's pretty good documentation, writing and running tests, testing tools, advanced testing topics. You can go in here. So here's an example. It should look, the basic idea is pretty familiar, right? Here's an actual test. It has to start with test underscore, just like, Python unit test. And then here we also have access to this setup. So you may recall setup will run once for every single test. So if you want, these things to get created every single test, if you have 5 tests, this will run 5 times. There's also a class version which only runs once for the whole class. So every test will share that. So set up class. Let's see. Let me try the next one maybe. Okay. So yeah, just looking around the documentation, there's a setup class. So here's an example. They encourage you to also call super. So this is common in Django. You have it, very complicated class hierarchies, and you're typically going to want to hand off whatever you're doing. Like you make your modification and then hand it off to Django so it can complete its cycle, because it's probably doing a bunch of other complicated things. So I'm going to copy this, and we'll write a method that is going to create just a few records in the database. We'll create some students. So S1 equals student. So I'm going to import that from models import student dot objects dot create, and I have to pass in name. Look at the model. I have to pass in name. Date enrolled should get added automatically, and question is optional. So there are a few things we could test with this. We could test, that all you have to supply is the name, and that this will get added, and that this will be null. You can try adding this. You can try, adding this to make sure it shows up. So doing a few tests like that just to make sure that your model is doing what you expect it to do. Name equals Jill, and let's do question equals. Actually, I don't think I'll need to access these objects. You just need to actually create stuff. Okay. All right, so we've got the setup class, and now I'm going to write a method that will make sure, for example, def test student has automatic date. So then I will grab the student. So this should be in our database. So by the way, when you run these unit tests, Django will create it doesn't use your actual database. So it'll create its own temporary database that it'll destroy at the end of the tests. So you can do whatever you want there. All right, so S1 equals student dot objects dot get, and ID equals 1. So that should be Bob. And then I'm just going to make sure, so self dot assert. There's a whole bunch of assert statements. So I want to see if the date is not none. S1 dot date enrolled. And to run the test, it's Python manage.py and then test. So Python manage.py test. And of course, okay, and this works. Okay, so that test passes. You can write another test real quick. And let's do 2, 2. So we'll make sure that yeah, I mean, we could, there are a few ways we could do this. Assert is not none question. You can also, let's do assert is none for that. S1 dot question, and then we'll do assert is not one, S1 dot question. Oops, S2. Okay, so okay, so I have a problem here. I wrote 2 tests, but it says it only ran 1 test. So who sees the problem?
the same name.
Yeah, yeah. So I was lazy and I just copy pasted. I didn't update it. So test student has question. Run this again. I should see two tests and they both pass. So there are other things you can do. Our model isn't really doing anything terribly interesting, but you can. As you saw from the validations and stuff, you can write your own methods. You can do, all kinds of complex validation checking and stuff like that, which you can then also test here. Okay, so let's test some views. I'm just gonna write this here. So class. Um, all right, and I guess I'll do the same thing probably. All right, so what are some things I could test in the view? There are a whole bunch of methods. So let me do, let's see. Yeah, so we'll look at the client stuff in a second. I just want to try something simpler. All right. Actually, yeah. So we'll do. Okay. So we'll do a relatively simple one first. Testing the client. Where are we here? All right. So if you look at the documentation, it'll tell you that by default, because you inherit from this Django test case, that you get access to a client object. So there's something called self.client. So def test underscore list view works. I'm not sure we're going to test yet. We'll see. And then what we can do is self.client. So client will be basically like something that enables you to make requests. And then you can configure that in different ways. Here we're using the what comes automatically, which has like get. You can make get requests or post requests. You can also create your own instance. You have to import the class and create the. Let me see if I can find an example. So for example, here you can import the client and create your own instance if you have custom stuff you need to do. For our purposes right now, you don't need to do that, but that's an option. So here you can make a get request to a given view. And just like in the rest of your code, if you have named your views in the URLs, if you've given them names, you can use those names elsewhere in the code and in the tests. So I'm going to do that as well. So I'll test student detail first. Well, okay, we're doing list view, so let's do list view. And then what I pass in the get could be it's ultimately going to be a relative path or a URL, but I can get that dynamically from Django by using the reverse. So I'm going to import that. So from Django.urls import reverse. So we've used this method before in the view. Actually, this should probably be calling reverse, redirect reverse, but that's fine. Okay, so we have reverse. So now we can do get and reverse and then pass in the name of that route, which is going to be all students. And we'll just print that for now. All right, if we run this test, So here's what that is: HTTP response object, status code, blah blah blah. So a few simple things we could test that the status code is 200 because we should be able to access it. So basically, you're testing that it exists. You can also do, let's see, this is getting past context. I believe it is. Yes. So response dot context. So here, the view. So this is the all students view right now. It's getting passed in this context. So in the test, you can actually have access to that. So in this case, we're getting all the students, and in our test here, we should just have two students available to us. So we could do something like test the length of the students. So just to make sure, I mean, there's all kinds of tests we could do here, but let's see. Messages. Let's see. It looks like this is the, let's see, -1. Okay. Let's try students. Yes. Okay. So that's the actual context. We're passing in this this object. Well, students. So we can see what that is, and then this should have. I think you can access length on a query set. Let me just try that real quick. Bob, Jill. Okay. So it looks like what's happening is that we're getting duplicate objects here from this other test. So that is an issue. So one thing you can do is clean up. So there's a setup class. There should also be a teardown class. It might actually be called teardown class. Teardown. Let me just double check. Teardown class. Okay, so I'm gonna copy that. And then let's see. I'm not sure how to. You could truncate the database. You can just delete everything. I might have to delete things individually. Student dot objects dot delete. Let's do pk equals 1. Let's see if this works. Does anyone know how to delete offhand? So let's see. Oh,
You
yeah.
gotta get first.
Yeah. Okay. These are still sticking around for some reason. Uh, Let me try a filter. Maybe not. I think it must be because this is getting run as one thing. That is still not, that doesn't seem quite right to me. So one thing I can do to avoid this problem for now, at least, um, I'd have to play around and see exactly what's happening, but I can just use setup. So it's a little bit more wasteful because I'm doing this for every single test, but I'll just do that for now. So okay, just gonna copy this. Let's see if that solves our problem. There we go. Okay, so now we actually only have two objects in this query set. So I'm not sure exactly what was happening. That's not what I would expect, but probably just doing something. Okay, so now this is just getting called for every single test. So now we can see. Let's test the length. All right, so that's 2. So now we can write our assert statement. So self.assert equal, and that should be equal to 2. Okay. So that works. You can also test. You can test if a particular template got called. Let's do that real quick. All right, so we're gonna still make that same request, and this time we're gonna check response templates. So we should be able to pull this out and then do a test like for we can check if certain values are there. So assert contains, assert set a response, produce blah blah blah. So you pass in a response, and then it will tell you if it has something. So you do self dot assert contains, and you give it the response, and then you can check and see if it has a particular value. So I've got the list view. Let's say all students, the list view, and let's just say the first student is Bob. The first student is Bob, so Bob should appear in there. Let's should see if that works. Okay, so we know that the correct template is being, being served up, and the HTML is being generated correctly. Okay, so the hard part, so you can do this kind of thing and go through. You can look at the documentation and see the kinds of things you can test, and then write tests for them. The hard part here, because we added this API call, right? So we added this API call, and which means that, every time if we were to test this post route, so let's go ahead and do that now. And I'll use the client, except I'm not going to make a get request. I'm going to make a post request, and it's not going to be all students. It's going to be create student. And let me just make sure that has the same name here, create student. So what's going to happen now, if I run this test, it's actually going to make a real API call. And in a production application, you don't want to be doing that. For one, you're probably not going to have access to like real credentials, so your credentials might not work. If this server is down or whatever, or you're not able to access it, maybe you're running in a different network or something like that, then the test is going to fail. And so you have this external dependency. This is this is a side effect, and you don't want to make unit tests dependent on side effects. So what do you do about that? Basically, you're going to have to mock it. And there are a couple ways you can do that. So built into Django, not Django, the unit test framework is a patch. So patching is basically something like an actual object exists, right? So we have requests.get or Django.test case. So we can import these things, and they live in a particular namespace and address. What we can do is we can basically override the name. So if I did something like x equals print, I could do x high. So I've overridden or shadowed essentially this print function. So I've given it another name, like an alias here, but there are other things you can do to basically block this from being called. And so patching is one of them. So when we call our tests, we don't want the actual requests library to make this get request. So this is kind of complicated, but this is the stuff you have to do when you have side effects. So we're gonna have to import some things. One is going to be patch. So from unit test dot mock import patch, and you can use patch as a decorator. And what you do is you pass it a string of the like full address or full name of the thing that you want to override. In that case is request. This is the library, the third-party library that we installed. Requests.get. So we don't want this to happen. So we're going to override that. And then when you do that, this decorator is going to pass in. So remember, a decorator is a way of modifying another function. It's going to add another parameter, which is going to be basically like a mock object. So it'll be a fake version of this that you can manipulate. So fake get. And it's complicated, so I don't want to spend too much time going through it, but uh, one thing, in some ways, this is a doubly complicated example because we're not just we don't just need to modify or to mock get. We also need to modify this method on the get object. So if we stop here, I'll just go ahead and run this and show you. Where are we now? Test. Yeah, I'll just go ahead and run this. It should error. Okay. So a few things. So this post request is going to expect some stuff, right? Student name. Okay, so it's going to expect student name. So we need to pass it another. This is like the body of the request. So if we look at our form here, which we don't have loaded at the moment, but the minimum that we need from this request is an object that has the value of student name. So we'll pass in student name. We'll run this again. And we've got an error. We're trying to save something. Let's see. This is a different error. Failed to insert expression. Let me just double check real quick. Okay, so what's happening is the rest of this test is running, but we have mocked this. So this is now a mock object, and a mock object will allow itself to be called with any value. So it doesn't throw an error here. It just keeps getting passed through, but it tries to create an object with a magic mock, as you can see here. So that's not going to work. So we're gonna have to do something else. So I'm just going to copy this. So if you look at you have to look at the documentation here. It's a pain. So we can directly mock this get request. The issue is that this get request returns something which has a JSON method on it. So we can't directly mock that because we have to create an instance of this other thing. So it just doesn't quite work that way. There's a workaround, and I'll show you. But first, we can take a look at the source code just so we know why that is. Actually, I'll go back here and we'll look at the R. Request.get. So get sends a get request. This is from the requests library, and it returns a response object. So, and that response object, let's see, this exists anywhere. Yeah, I have to go digging around for that request. Need to keep going, and finally, here we go. So you have to jump around a bunch, but you can actually find the request object that it's going to return. And it's got some parameters. Let's see if I can actually go here. Here's the definition of the request object. And doesn't have any required parameters. So in order to mock it, that's actually nice for mocking purposes because we don't have to give it, we don't have to worry about these other values. But we are going to have to mock that. So again, I'm just going to show you without going into detail. Let's get rid of this, get rid of this, get rid of that. So I'm going to add this kind of, this is going to be that mock response object. And because it doesn't take any required parameters and we're going to fake everything anyway, we can just create it like this. The only thing is we just have to make sure it has a JSON method on it. And that's because we have to call JSON. So what we really want to fake is this return value. We don't want it to make this call, and we want to fake the return value. So you make the get request, it returns this response object. We're going to fake that. And we're going to do, what's it called? It's like side effect, default side effect. And that is going to be okay. So we're mocking this get, which is going to return a response object, and then we're also basically going to mock the JSON method on that response object, and that's how you have to do that here. It is a pain, but that's how it is. All right. Test that. Okay, so I don't think we need to pass this in anymore. And so we're going to make this post request here. And then let's see. So we should get this new student added. Dot objects dot get. And we have 2 already. So this should be the third one. So this should exist. ID equals 3. And then self dot cert. You can do cert equal s dot name equals whatever we passed in here, your student. Whoops, no. We don't actually need a response there for this test. Test post route. Okay, so I am going to have to add something. I'm not going to use it in this particular test, but and that passed. So it is a pain, especially for that particular. That's a little tricky because we're mocking the object and then it calls another method. But that's how you do that. You can also, you can do things like test that you get redirected to a particular place. So after the post request gets made, you get redirected to that. But this has gone on for a little longer than I had hoped. So that's kind of Django testing in slightly less than or more than a nutshell. So you have your views and your templates. You can test a number of different things. Most of the test is exactly like Python's built-in unit test with some extra stuff like this client that you get, and you can also test the particular template got called, and then things like mocking. If you have side effects like making API calls, the database itself is kind of mocked for you, so that's nice. Oftentimes you'll have to mock the database, but Django takes care of that for you. Yeah. So that's it. I know that was a lot. Are there any questions?
I have one from way earlier. What level is your environment file at? Can't quite tell.
Yes, sorry about that. The environment file is at the so it's above the actual Django project itself.
Or I meant the one we created um to hold our API key.
Oh, the .env. Yes. So
Yeah.
that is at the root level of the project, at the same level as the git ignore and okay.